area hair count, where it's increasing to have more vellus. Say that's the mechanism of action of minoxidil, that minoxidil is increasing the number of vellus hairs, and then you would have something, again, just for example, not obviously not being the case, it hasn't been fleshed out, but then you might have something like P-1075, changing those vellus hairs into intermediate hairs. So when you're looking at the paper, what jumps out when you read the charts is that all drugs except for diazoxide increase cysteine incorporation, with P-1075 being among the most pronounced responders. So P-1075 is beating out minoxidil, it's beating out monoxide sulfate, it's beating out diazoxide. Hello everyone and welcome back to yet another video. So today we're looking at this old paper from 1992 from Bull, Walden, and Conrad titled, quote, Potassium Channel Conductance, a mechanism affecting hair growth both in vitro and in vivo, unquote, and it was published in 1992, and it circles around a decades-old mystery, and that is how opening intracellular potassium ATP channels can directly sustain follicular hair growth. Before we continue this video, I would like to mention that we now have liposomal monoxidil sulfate on my website, folligens.com, folligenz.com, and if the order queue is available and open, you can order it there. We're running it as a cosmetic. There are other sort of botanicals inside of this particular topical that are pretty helpful when it comes to conditioning the hair. So that's at folligens.com, folligenz.com. That's folligenz.com. Go check it out and maybe even try it out. See you there. So this paper has two parts. The first part of the paper deals with cultured mice whisker hairs. So for 3 days, they exposed the hair follicles, these whisker hair follicles, to various potassium channel opener compounds that span different chemotypes. You had minoxidil sulfate being the active metabolite, pinoxidil, and a pinoxidil analog called P-1075. Then we had RP-49356. We also had diazoxide in this study, and for those of you who don't know, I already made a video about diazoxide use, where we looked at a case study of this child who used diazoxide to treat hyperinsulinemia, which is a condition where there is an excessive amount of insulin in the bloodstream, which obviously would cause for hypoglycemia. But yes, this is a potassium channel opener that the researchers were studying to see if it could also lead to hair growth. We also have chromiculum and nicorandil. So the researchers measured hair shaft building by feeding the follicles a sulfur-containing amino acid that they could track, and this was radio-labeled cysteine. They kept these follicles in a culture medium that was spiked with this particular cysteine tracer for a set amount of time. And then it was here, as the follicles were exposed to this growth medium, they would pull in the cysteine and used it to create new keratin. So in other words, the follicles were given a tagged building block, and the team checked how much of it ended up locked into the growing fiber of the hair follicle. So basically, it's like a biochemical odometer. And because keratin is naturally rich with cysteine, a more incorporated label, so more cysteine, means more true hair shaft protein being built. So the more cysteine that you have that's being used for that hair production that you can actually trace, you can essentially say, oh shit, okay, this means that this particular follicle, due to some sort of, chemical reason, maybe it's being stimulated more, is using more of that cysteine to build itself up, right? And then you can essentially assess which chemical is responsible for more cysteine uptake. So mind you, this is the in vitro portion of the study. So this is the first part of the study where they're specifically looking at mice whisker hairs. So when you're looking at the paper, what jumps out when you read the charts is that all drugs except for diazoxide increase cysteine incorporation, with P-1075 being among the most pronounced responders. So P-1075 is beating out minoxidil, it's beating out minoxidil sulfate, it's beating out diazoxide, and admittedly, actually, the paper notes that diazoxide has a poor aqueous solubility, so maybe that limited its tested dose range. So that's probably, it's going to be a bit of a rate limiter. It could be the case that diazoxide might be more potent than 1075, or P-1075 rather, but just in this paper alone, the poor aqueous solubility kind of limited its response, right? The hair follicle's response, because, again, it's not soluble enough for it to be used. And that likely explains its flat bar relative to the other potassium channel openers. The rank order you infer visually just by looking at the bar heights is that P-1075 is near the top, then it's minoxidil, then it's chromacolin. Those are the ones that are clearly positive. Now, the follicles exposed to panicidil and nicorandil, they have sort of modest cysteine uptake. And the follicles exposed to RP49356 have a weak cysteine uptake. So we can already see here that you can't just use any sort of potassium channel opener, and there probably is a greater mechanism of action at play that determines which one is actually capable of growing hair and which ones aren't. Now, moving on to the second part of the study, where it actually validates the findings in the first part of the study where we use the mouse whisker hair follicles, we're now going to be looking at macaque monkeys. Now, macaque monkeys have androgenetic alopecia, and what's cool about them is that because humans are primates, and these monkeys are primates, I mean, that's why they're monkeys, in terms of a physiological response to these chemicals, humans and primates in general should have some sort of similar mechanism of action when it comes to some disease models. And also, potentially, the idea is that the treatments that we use in these non-human primates should translate well to humans. So this is why this sort of in vivo test actually gives a good preclinical foundation to further testing of these other potassium channel openers on human scalp hair follicles. The study model was very simple. They had various monkeys that were exposed to minoxidil, P-1075, chromacolin, or RP49356 for 4 to 5 months. So this was a pretty long study, a decent amount of time to observe any sort of hair follicle stimulatory pro-growth effects. The researchers did this part of the study pretty well. They shaved the sites monthly of the balding areas where they were applying the potassium channel opener chemicals to, and they also weighed the regrown hair to quantify the response. So they were actually getting the weight of the hair, and the idea is if the hair is becoming thicker over time, that means that these potassium channel openers are improving the hair shaft health and its dynamics. So it's causing for the hair shaft to have a higher uptake in cysteine, and that cysteine is going to be used to build the keratin of the hair follicle, which would just be a more improved hair strand. Now, I'm wondering, before we even look at the results, I'm wondering if potential treatments in the future could be maybe something like P-1075, along with additional, I guess you can say, antioxidants or amino acid treatment like with cysteine, right, being incorporated, to see if you can encourage some vellus hairs to potentially transition into intermediate or terminal hairs, right? Because nobody's really using topical P-1075. Maybe it could be the case you could have different potassium channel openers where one is primarily focused on increasing the hair shaft width, and then the other ones more so stimulate the overall total area hair count, where it's increasing to have more vellus hairs, right? Let's say that's the mechanism of action of minoxidil, that minoxidil is increasing the number of vellus hairs, and then you would have something, again, just for example, not obviously not being the case, it hasn't been fleshed out, but then you might have something like P-1075, changing those vellus hairs into intermediate hairs. But anyway, I digress. So the animal data mirrored the in vitro study that we looked at before with the mice whisker hair follicles, and it did so with remarkable fidelity. Minoxidil, P-1075, and chromacolin produced significant increase in hair weight, whereas RP49356 pretty much had no effect. Which again was the case with the in vitro study with the mice hair follicles, or whisker follicles, where RP49356 didn't encourage as much cysteine uptake as the other potassium channel openers did. Well, you might be questioning how come it's the case you have mice hair follicles and macaque monkey hair follicles essentially acting the same way. And although the hair follicles are different, mice hair and, non-human primate hair and even human primate hair are not the same, and they all have different hair follicle genetics between each other, there's a case to be made that because they're all mammals, right? We're all mammals here in this particular study, that there might be a common pathway in which hair is grown that these potassium channel openers are all touching on, which will lead to a common species response of essentially pro-hair growth stimulatory effects. That concordance is why the authors argue the paper provides correlative but strong evidence that potassium or KATP channels and the very act of opening those channels is an important regulatory lever for follicle growth. So allow me to reiterate, the same molecules that lifted the culture bar chart, so the same molecules that were doing well on the mice hair follicles in vitro, also performed well in vivo by thickening primate hair scalp sites over months. And it looks like, again, between that in vivo and in vitro study, P-1075 looks like a phenomenal standout, actually beating minoxidil. Mechanistically speaking, P-1075 is a high-potency potassium channel opener, and it's essentially a more optimized version of the other potassium channel opener drug, Minoxidil. It more effectively opens follicular potassium channels, hyperpolarizing the cells and biasing them towards maintaining anagen or the active growth phase, which then translates into more sustained hair shaft production. And obviously, cysteine uptake. Unlike minoxidil, which relies on cutaneous sulforotransferase enzymatic activity to become the active minoxidil sulfate, P-1075 is directly active without any enzymatic conversion. So essentially, as soon as you give the P-1075 to the cells, it doesn't need to be converted into something else to open those potassium channel cells. And it seems to be the case that in the follicular dermopapilla, so in the dermopapilla area of the follicle, as well as the outer root sheath of the follicle, and again, this area is typically where sulforotransferase would otherwise convert minoxidil into minoxidil sulfate, but it seems to be the case that sustained potassium efflux via the potassium channel hyperpolarizes the membrane and dampens calcium influx and essentially is pushing the follicle towards a proliferative, anagen-supportive phase.
So to put it simply, when potassium flows out of a follicle cell, the inside of the cell becomes more negative. That makes the cell's calcium gates open less often, so less calcium enters. With lower calcium coming in, the cell is more likely to stay in a hair-making mode, which is the anagen growth phase. And at the same time, we need to remember that cysteine is a core building block for hair's main protein, keratin. As the new hair hardens, pairs of cysteine link together to form cysteine bonds that make the hair strand strong. In the study, the scientists fed follicles with radio-tagged cysteine and later measured how much of that tagged cysteine ended up locked into the hair. So if they found more tagged cysteine in the hair, that means the follicle made more real hair protein, which, if you can check which molecule was responsible for that, that means you can find out which molecule has the best hair growth effects. And in this case, in both the in vitro study using the mice hair whiskers and in the in vivo study using those stump-tail rhesus macaque monkeys, P-1075 outperformed all of the other potassium channel activators. So I had to come in and correct this bit because it was corrupted, and my voice sounds different because it is a different day and it's in the morning. So sorry for the large fluctuation there. So P-1075 is not an official drug for over-the-counter use, especially when it comes for androgenetic alopecia. To my knowledge, I don't think it's gone through any sort of clinical trial testing, so there's that. There's no way you're going to get it be approved for the specific use for hair loss, but perhaps you may be able to get it from those experimental kind of websites. But again, I'm not telling you to do that. but there are perhaps other sort of loopholes where you can legitimately get P-1075 and you can legitimately use it, but those are some very, very narrow loopholes, I guess you can say. So anyway, let's get ready for the voice change because I had to come in here and re-record this part in the morning. So let's get ready for that in 3, 2, 1. Now, we have another channel opener, potassium channel opener, that some people have notified me about. And unlike Minoxidil and the other potassium channel openers in that particular class that we saw in the Bull et al. 1992 paper, there's another one called Kopyrrol, and this is a more modern potassium channel opener. The most frequently cited clinical piece, I guess you can say somewhat clinical piece, comes from Vincenzi et al. 2018, which tested a multi-ingredient leave-on solution, being spectral DNC-N, in women with early pattern hair loss. The formulation also contained another substance called PDPO and also other active ingredients. Now, when it comes to outcomes, it seemingly improved hair follicle dynamics. So it reduced the amount of shedding hair, but also it increased the hair mass and density. But because PDPO and other many active components were included in this solution, you really can't attribute the effect specifically to Kopyrrol. It could be the case that the other active ingredients are also just as important to really make Kopyrrol shine, or maybe they're solely important and Kopyrrol's not important, but something about this particular solution from spectral DNC-N seems to be helpful, or the Kopyrrol might just be helpful too, right? But this paper is more so just a cosmetic validation paper, which you take it for what it's worth. It, at the very least, shows the specific formulation being somewhat good for hair growth. So when it comes to that product, I guess there's some sort of mild validity to it. But beyond that, much of what circulates on Kopyrrol originates from supplier dossiers and market slides claiming superiority to 5% minoxidil. And also it compares itself to other corny market gimmicks like the superiority of supposed Sonic Hedgehog or SHH mRNA boosters. So really, much of the work on Kopyrrol is just hypothesis generation, and it's not really peer-reviewed data, and usually it lacks assay standardization or independent replication. So I'm not saying it doesn't work. It could very well work, but there's just not much proof on it. But hey, you're welcome to try it out and see how it works for you. There are some websites where you can look for it. Kintor has a particular product, if I'm not mistaken, that contains Kopyrrol. I'll put it in the description below if you guys are interested, but it is their particular product called CoShine 0.9 KX826 plus 1.5% Kopyrrol plus 1% Copexyl max hair quote-unquote revitalizing spray rather, unquote. That has it, but it's a bit pricey, but in any case, it's there for you to go check out yourself. But in any case, if we go back to the bars in the Bull et al. 1992 paper, we can just clearly see that P-1075 seems to be a very intriguing high-potency potassium channel opener, which, who knows, could be a standout treatment that has gone unnoticed for quite some time. It's 2025 at the time of recording this video. It's September 18th, 2025, and this paper came out in 1992. So, yeah, P-1075 has been sitting on the shelf, and who knows, maybe it'll come to market one day. Who knows? But I have to say this, I started a company called Folligens Therapeutics Corporation. You can go to www.folligenz.com, that's folligens.com, where you can go there and look at the Sulfogens TM product. That is the Sulfogens TM product. It has minoxidil sulfate in this lipid matrix encapsulation that stabilizes it along with other sort of botanical benefits. We're running it as a cosmetic, so go check it out, read about the product over there on the website, and hey, maybe go try it out and see if you can get fuller looking hair. Anyway, thanks for watching this video, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace out.